So for a while after uploading my last devlog, I've been busy working on a bunch of little tweaks and bug fixes here and there. And while I'm very happy to get rid of a lot of those little problems that have been bugging me for so long, they weren't really interesting enough for me to make a YouTube video about them. So I decided to finish them all off camera and then take 10 days to work on some more interesting features. So, welcome to Devlog 8 of Cloverskar, where I'm going to show you 10 days of Metroidvania development in one video. Day 1, I decided to finally create a design for the red circles in the glide section just to start making this scene feel a bit nicer. I ended up drawing this smooshy looking ball, since that's kind of the theme of this level. After importing the sprite into Unity and making some small adjustments, I also added an idle animation which simply rotates the ball and makes it jump slightly up and down. I also added a short script I wrote to randomize the beginning position of the animation so that the spheres wouldn't simultaneously all go through the same animation at the same time. This makes the animation feel more random and organic. Finally, I created some particles which would play when the player hits one of the spheres to make it look like the sphere is exploding. If this game seems like something you might like, consider supporting the development by adding the game to your wishlist on Steam. The link will be in the description. Day 2, I wanted to return to the new enemy I briefly showed in the last devlog, which also uses the red circles I just redesigned. So I switched up the placeholder objects with the new design, and I also made the enemy attack the player by shooting one of the objects in the player's direction. The objects fly for a second and a half before getting destroyed, unless they hit the player or the ground on their way. After defeating this enemy, the player can advance to the part of the map where the heal ability can be picked up. Day 3, after placing the heal ability in the world, I wanted to rework the old ability unlocked screen. The one I had was okay, but I wanted to make it a bit smaller and simpler. So I went with this design, which I think is much more pleasant to look at, and also I was able to include a short description text as well as display the mana cost of the ability for the abilities that actually use mana. So I quickly updated the script which controls the information being displayed to also include this new information, and the new screen was ready to go. Day 4, I wanted to return to the glide section and make the visuals stand out a bit more just so it's easier to see where the glide section begins and where it ends. I added a subtle blue glow to begin with, which helps a little bit, but just to make things even more clear, I also added these clover particles, which are very similar to the ones from the glide ability. This should hint to the player that the glide ability needs to be used inside of these sections. Then I added some of the background assets just to see how the glide section looks along with a more finished scene, and I was pretty happy with the result. Lastly, I updated the color of the checkpoint owl to better fit with the blue colors of the scene. Day 5, I wanted to continue reworking placeholder graphics, so I came back to the bouncy tile and gave it a fresh look with this rounded sprite that kinda looks like jelly, with some particles floating inside the block. Day 6, I wanted to finally work out a design for the map, since it didn't really fit with the overall aesthetic of the game. The way I render the map is by having a separate tile map, which I paint over all of the levels, and I have a separate camera that renders only this tile map. The camera then outputs into a render texture, and I place that texture into a raw image inside of the canvas. I can then turn this image on and off by pressing the map button. The main thing I wanted to change with how the map looked is that I wanted to create an outline around the tiles representing the empty space of the world. Now, I did try just drawing some line tiles that I could paint in on top of my tile map, but I wasn't really happy with the result, and there were a couple of problems with this approach. For example, since I have these rounded corners in my map, the amount of different lines I would have to draw to cover all of the shapes just didn't seem like something I wanted to deal with. But the main problem was that I wanted the line thickness to stay the same if I zoom in and out, but if the outline is just a sprite renderer, the lines would expand as I zoomed in and shrink as I zoom out. So after scrapping the line tiles idea and reconsidering my options, I decided to come back the next day with a brand new approach. So the next day my idea was to try using the shader graph to create an outline shader for the render texture. The way it would work is it would create duplicates of the image and shift them in all 4 directions. If I select the area the original image was occupying and I erase that part from the duplicate image, you can see that I'm left with something that resembles an outline. In this example though, you can see that the outline doesn't cover the corners of the square, but I wanted to try it out anyway just to see what it will look like. And as I thought, it's pretty close, but those little imperfections really stand out. So instead of shifting the image left, right, up and down, I tried shifting it diagonally so that the entire square shape would be covered. Now this does solve the problem for this kind of example, but if the square is rotated, then we have the same problem. So I decided to combine these two approaches and combine all 8 directions to form the outline, and this did create a near perfect outline. The only problem was around these arrows, which represent passages to the unexplored areas of the map. Because of their irregular shape, I just couldn't get the outline to look right on them. There was the possibility of adding even more directions to the outline shader graph, but even with these 8 directions, the graph was becoming quite hard to organize. The next day, after some time of trying to figure out if there was a way to simplify the shader graph while still increasing the number of directions, I actually decided to scrap the shader graph approach altogether and just write the shader manually the old-fashioned way. And I was pleasantly surprised when I managed to come up with the solution much more quickly than while working with the shader graph. Even though I enjoy working with the shader graph, I feel like writing the code gives you much more control and is much more manageable and compact. And in the end, I was able to get the result I was going for. I even had some time left over that day to implement some map controls like moving the map around and zooming in and out. And with that, I was ready to take a break from the map system. On day 9, I was taking a look back at the combat ability I added recently where the player needs to land 3 consecutive shots on an enemy in order for this precision challenge to appear, and if the player lands the precision challenge, a more powerful shot is fired which deals some extra damage. In the comments of my last devlog, there were some concerns about this ability, where people didn't really like the fact that the player wouldn't have complete control over the timing of the shot, since the precision challenge is randomized. And there were concerns in general that the ability might be a little bit too clunky and not fluid enough. And the more I played around with this ability, the more I agreed with the comments. So I tried brainstorming some ideas about how I could improve these things, but in the end I felt like the mechanic might be too complicated to make more intuitive and less clunky. So I decided to get rid of this mechanic completely and try something much more simple. Since the way shooting the bow already works by charging the shot by holding the mouse button and then releasing it to shoot, I wanted to try to implement a supercharge mechanic where you can keep holding the mouse button after the bow has been charged, and if you hold it for long enough, you activate the super shot. So I added this circle that starts filling up after the bow gets fully pulled, and once the circle is filled up, the super shot is activated. This mechanic is much more simple, but I think gameplay wise it's gonna be much more intuitive. I'm definitely gonna keep playing around with some ideas, but make sure you let me know in the comments what you think about this new way of doing the special attack. Day 10, I decided to finally start working on some new enemies, since it's been forever since I've added a new one. To begin with, I created a template object for both flying and grounded enemies, so that I would have a nice starting point when creating new ones. My idea for today was to create a grounded enemy which wanders around and doesn't really care about the player unless the player touches it, which makes the enemy explode, dealing 2 hearts of damage. I created this explosion prefab, which is just a circle collider which activates for a fraction of a second and checks if the player is touching the collider. If it is, the object deals some damage to the player. Next, I made it so that when this enemy is destroyed, it spawns one of these objects, which makes it look like the enemy explodes. As you can see for now, both the enemy and the explosion are just basic shapes serving as placeholders, since I didn't really have time on day 10 to create all the assets. I've also made it so that when the enemy is shot, there's a very short pause, and then the enemy explodes. Next, I created an alternative version of this enemy which chases the player, and when it gets to a certain distance, the explosion is triggered. I've considered also making a flying variation of this enemy, but I didn't want to spam the player with too many exploding enemies in one area, so I might leave that idea for some later sections of the game. If you guys have any suggestions about what this enemy could be, please let me know in the comments.